This is a Begisisa podcast.
Tobacco companies are in it for one thing only, and that's money. So any money that they spend into educating the population or trying to get the population to look at a particular aspect in the tobacco industry is money spent in order to make money. They won't waste money.
Welcome to this podcast. I'm Joan van Dijk. Tobacco is one of the leading causes of death in South Africa, but people access tobacco in lots of different ways, and illegal smuggling is one of them. But how does the illegal tobacco trade work? I spoke to Johan van Lochtenberg, a tax expert and whistleblower who used to work at the South African Revenue Service. So in 2018, the tobacco industry paid Ipsos, which is a market research company, to evaluate the size of the illegal cigarette market. You revealed this in your book as well in Tobacco Wars, that this research really was used as part of a campaign to kind of undermine tighter regulations on the industry. And there are other examples of tobacco funding going awry as well. And at Begisisa, we're very likely to report stories like this whenever there's tobacco money involved. We do often get questions on why it matters that tobacco money is involved. So my question to you is, in your experience, are we right to make a scene every time there's tobacco money? And how insidious has tobacco money been in the country in your experience?
I don't think there is an issue if tobacco companies spend their own money to conduct research and make such research public. In principle, I think this is not something new. It's been happening forever, as old as the tobacco industry is. I recall even as a child how research in the tobacco industry indicated that most dentists and doctors preferred a certain brand above another. And that was also research-based. At one level, of course, they can do any research they want. But in my example that I've just given you, the point is that if that research is intended to achieve a particular outcome by manipulation or what's known as social engineering, in other words, to make people see things in one particular way and not question something else, or distract people, or even misinform people, such as, in my view, the Ipsos reports achieved, then I think one should begin to ask questions why that is happening. I've always maintained that it's always been in the interest of big tobacco companies to have a very close relationship with government, both at a policy level as well as, in my own experience, at a law enforcement level. And that relationship is incestuous. It is such that they actually direct those activities. And it is akin to state capture, as we know it in South Africa. Now, if that's the case, then I think we should all be very, very concerned, because tobacco companies are in it for one thing only, and that's money. So any money that they spend into educating the population or trying to get the population to look at a particular aspect in the tobacco industry is money spent in order to make money. They won't waste money. Hypothetically, we don't see research products coming from Ipsos or any other similar institution on the harmful effects of tobacco on society. We don't see similar type of reports of the tax burden on non-smoking taxpayers in a country.
Now, there are lots of ways that you mentioned that the tobacco industry avoids paying their sin taxes, but they've all got very technical sounding names, the different kinds of export scams and how they work. Could you explain that to us and start off perhaps by ghost exports?
It's basically the practice of pretending to have exported tobacco product or cigarettes or whatever the case might be out of a particular jurisdiction away into another jurisdiction. And the fraud is then committed on the revenue service, and in particular the customs and excise division or component or service of any particular country. So it's really saying, here's a container full of cigarettes, for instance, and I've manufactured the cigarettes in South Africa and I've now exported it to Swaziland. Whereas in reality, you have not done so. All you've done is you've just processed the paperwork and pretend as if you've exported it. The benefit for you in that crime is that because you're taking it out of the country, in theory, it's not excisable. So you're not going to pay the necessary taxes on it because it's not for local consumption, and therefore it's not excisable, which is a significant portion of the cost of a packet of cigarettes that you buy if you buy them locally. And so if you then ghost export, in other words, it's a ghost, it's not a real export, and you then sell those cigarettes locally, the big portion of that amount that the consumer pays for the packet of cigarettes goes straight into the pocket of the exporter. In the case of a round trip, they do leave the country, but then they come back into the country. The name, in a way, does describe the nature of the scam. It's then exported, it's acquitted, everything looks okay to the customs department or service, but then they find their way back into the local market, and they are not identified as the same cigarettes or tobacco products that have been exported. They're either smuggled in or by way of misdeclaration or undervaluation or whatever the case might be, but they end up back into the jurisdiction that they've been exported from for local consumption. And then the exact same benefit occurs.
How have those cigarettes gotten back into South Africa? Is it as simple as a truck driving back over the border?
There are multiple ways, but I suppose the simplest way that I'm aware of would be literally coming through a place at the border where there is no port of entry. In other words, it's not seen as coming into the country. In South Africa, we have vast border lines that aren't monitored 24 hours a day. Another one is to literally just bring it through a port of entry, but misdeclare or underdeclare, and you take your chance. It's physically impossible for any customs service in the world, including the developed world, to stop and check each and every container that enters into that country. It's just not possible.
Could you explain how the companies sometimes get around this by undermining the counting mechanisms for how much is actually manufactured?
There's a sort of a language that used to be used in the tobacco industry where manufacturers would talk about number 2 stock or B stock. What that really referred to was the manufacturing of cigarettes that they did not record. Now, what we must remember is that excise tax is a tax at source. In other words, you pay the tax at the point where those cigarettes are made. So the manufacturers have to pay taxes on the number of cigarettes that they manufacture in any given period. They must declare the number of cigarettes that they've manufactured and then pay the excise tax on that to the South African Revenue Service in South Africa. And this is how it works the world over. All that then needs to happen is if you make X number of cigarettes on any given day in, let's say, a 12-hour shift, which is your number 1 stock, or the A stock, which is what you declare to the Revenue Service, and that's your legitimate stock. Then perhaps at night you run your midnight shift and there you manufacture your B stock, and that's completely off radar.
In tobacco wars, you describe various kinds of bad actors that are operating in the industry. If you could give us an example and what their role is in propping up the illegal cigarette trade.
In the South African context, in the years up to 2014 and a little bit into 2015, one of the big tobacco manufacturers in South Africa, British American Tobacco, made use of the services of a private security firm known as Forensic Security Services. They were staffed in the main by former law enforcement officials and military officers. They not only provided their services at a fee to the British American Tobacco, they also provided it to a body that represented the big tobacco interests in South Africa, known as the Tobacco Institute of Southern Africa. And these were big contracts. They were paid tens of millions per annum. On the face of it, they were required to conduct investigations into illicit activity within the tobacco industry in South Africa, and then pass that on to the relevant law enforcement agencies. What these guys brought with them was a network of their old friends with whom they used to work in the different law enforcement agencies. And so these lines blurred very quickly, and it became extremely incestuous to a point where they were able to dictate to multi-agency tobacco task team or even other law enforcement officers from time to time who to target, who to investigate, and what to investigate. They would deliberately set about to sabotage commercial competitors, or they would deliberately spy on us and our families. And I even saw files with photographs of some of our children or our family members and our homes. Where we were supposed to be working together on these things, we became the enemy. they illegally listened to telephone conversations, or where the police officials or state security officials intercepted telephone conversations of commercial competitors. Those conversations were illegally handed over to these private investigators. They ran secret slush funds. They ran all sorts of bogus front companies. In a sense, it kind of was almost a pretext upon which those people who were involved in state capture capitalized upon, because everybody suddenly had a common enemy in people within the South African Revenue Service. In the case of the SIN spies, which refers to an acronym that was used by forensic security services to keep track of their own spies that they employed to conduct these activities, and each one then had a number. So there would be a SIN number 123, for instance, and they would use that number to hide the identity of the person. And there were hundreds of these people all over the country, and not only in South Africa, also in neighboring states and elsewhere. And they would be paid cash, and that money would obviously be deducted as an expense in the production of income, or it would not be declared at all. And those people receiving the money would receive it in cash, and they would not declare it for income tax.
What was a Travelex spy, and how did they play into the system?
So the Travelex spies relate to a different group of people who were being managed by British American Tobacco out of their offices in London. One such person in South Africa was a lawyer. This person was an attorney, and the attorney was professing to act for the commercial competitors of British American Tobacco. And so British American Tobacco in the UK wanted access to secret files or confidential files of their commercial competitors. In this case, this attorney represented one particular individual who did not only have tobacco interests within South Africa, but on the whole continent. And in that case, then, as a means to remunerate and to effectively pay the bribe to that attorney, they had to find a way to do it so that nobody would know about this. And the solution that they came up with was to use what's commonly known as cash passports. These are debit cards. So you have to pay money into the account, and then those cards can be used worldwide at an ATM or similar to normal debit cards to pay for things. And so the operatives in the United Kingdom would deposit the money, typically at Heathrow Airport, into these Travelex cards. Travelex is the brand. It's not the only brand that provides these cash passports. There are many others. And they're the more modern version of the old traveler's checks. So it's really just a debit card where you load money on, and then somebody can use it elsewhere as they travel instead of having to carry the cash. So the money would be deposited in the United Kingdom, and then this attorney would, in South Africa, withdraw this cash from an ATM. And in that way, it would circumvent both the money laundering regulations in the United Kingdom and in South Africa, as well as the revenue system, because nobody would know of these things.
Could you just explain how the double agents worked as kind of fixers and brokers between the tobacco companies and the revenue service?
Typically, it would work like this. And again, it's not something unique to the tobacco industry, but you always find those people who would go around professing to sell influence. It would be somebody who would say, look, I know you're in trouble with the South African Revenue Service. I know the guy who's overseeing the project that concerns you. His name's Johan van Loggemerg. I know him very well. I can actually make your problem go away. But you're going to have to pay me 100,000 Rand a week. Now, obviously, you can't speak to him directly because he's not going to speak to you directly. I'm his man. I'm collecting the money on his behalf. Depending how desperate the person is, and he is in trouble then at that particular point in time, he then starts paying 100,000 Rand a week with the hope that his problem will go away. The novelty of that particular type of extortion is that even if the person who's been paying this bribe, ostensibly to me now, even when he discovers that it's a complete hoax, there's nothing he can do, because for him to complain about it, he would first have to admit that he paid bribes. Now, what these fixers would do is they would actually demonstrate their ability to influence. So these would be people who would be capable of, let's say, accessing my phone number and calling me for something entirely different. in front of the mark, if I can use that term. And then at the end of the conversation, we'd say, okay, and Johan, by the way, there's another matter that we've spoken about, or I will still come and speak to you about. I'll give you a call a bit later. And what this tobacco manufacturer would then see is how familiar this person is with me, and therefore it must be so. And that's typically how these fixers would run these scams. In other instances, they would actually have influence over people within not just the revenue service, but also law enforcement agencies, either by way of corrupt money that had been paid or other ways in which they may have compromised those people. The last thing, of course, is this sort of rumor mongering. And I see that's become pretty common these days in South Africa, is that the moment somebody is appointed or put in a position of power where they might make a difference in combating organized crime, the next thing you hear about is some anonymous dossier being leaked to somebody. And those dossiers are sometimes very sophisticated, and they are added all sorts of bits and pieces that are factual, that check out, nothing wrong, but the rest is hocus pocus. And then these stories are just so salacious or so sensational that they must be reported on, and that then creates some kind of attraction in society. And the next thing you know, the poor person is under pressure. And it's about smearing. In my own experience, that was kind of the last resort after the threats and the attempts to bribe and everything else failed. To quote one of the tobacco manufacturers speaking to one of these spies, of which I have a recording, the two tobacco manufacturers sat with the spy in August 2014, and the words were, and I'm paraphrasing, "This Johan, we want him gone. He must be humiliated. He must be finished. He must be gone. We never want to see him again. He must just go. Whatever we must do, we must do. He must go."
The very last thing that I'm going to ask you for is to just tell us about the woman that you called Anna in your book.
She is a single mother. She happened to work in one tobacco manufacturer in a particular province in the country. A fairly low-paying job, but she was capable of managing her money wisely. She came across a flyer where she was invited to apply for a higher-paying job at a new company that was going to start up in due course, also in the tobacco industry. She spent a bit of money to put together a CV. She went to an internet shop. She had to obviously pay taxi money to do that. She had to pay someone to make a CV for her. She also borrowed a dress. She arrived at the interview only to discover that no such company was in the offing. It was a complete scam. These people just wanted her to remain in the employ of the company that she was, but she had to spy for them. So they wanted her to take down the registration numbers of trucks that came in and out and provide them with inside information from within the factory. That particular front company that she was fooled by, or defrauded as far as I'm concerned, happened to be one that was funded by British American Tobacco through Forensic Security Services. Of course, she was terribly disappointed and distraught afterwards, and so were her children. She, for me, symbolizes the unseen, unspoken, unthought of individuals whose lives are affected in one way or another in a manner that nobody can comprehend unless you know about these things. And I have no doubt that they did achieve, to some extent, by recruiting some people who were then prepared to do this for extra money, not because they wanted to, but because they perhaps, found they had this absolute need for additional income. In Anna's case, her values were just such that she just simply refused to do it.
That was Johan van Logrenberg, a whistleblower and former executive at the South African Revenue Service. That's it from me, Joan van Dijk. Keep an eye out for our next podcast in the near future. Goodbye until next time.
This was a Peggy Sisa podcast.